Welcome again to another in our series of reflection on Georgia politics. Today we're going to discuss the administration of one of Georgia's great governors, Marvin Griffin. We have with us his son Sam, who is the editor of the Bainbridge Post-Searchlight, and Mr. Ben Wiggins, who is executive secretary to Governor Griffin, and a member of the Georgia Public Service Commission. So welcome, gentlemen. I'm anxious to get right into a discussion of S. Marvin Griffin.
Where would you like to start?
Let's start at the very beginning.
Okay, first let me say how much we appreciate you doing this, because outside of a few of us who are fewer in number every day and whose memories are not improving any, there are not a lot of people who can speak to it from a first-hand information, but he's certainly one of my favorite topics. I just began with his family. His father, Ernest Howard Pat Griffin, my grandfather, who died before I was born, so I never knew him. But vicariously, I feel like I did between the stories I've heard about him. But he was a member of the House for several different terms, and I suppose that's where my dad got his love of politics, because he would come up to Atlanta with him during the session, and they would stay in the old
Henry Grady.
No, this was before Henry Grady was where the governor's mansion was.
How about the Kimball House?
The Kimball
Kimball
House. I
House.
couldn't think Kimball House. Thank you, man. It takes two of us to come up with it. But at the Kimball House, and then he would wander around Atlanta. You could do that then. And he remembers while his father was in the legislature, and he remembers coming up to the governor's mansion there where the Henry Grady was, and swinging on the gate. And the policeman came along there and told him he couldn't do that. He said, "Want to know whose house it was?" He told him. He said, "Well, you can't swing on the gate." He said, "But would you like to be in there one day?" And he said, "Yes." Said he'd like to live there. So that got him started, because he went to the Citadel, pitched baseball for the Citadel. In the summertime, he pitched baseball also for Sandlot teams. Used to go down to his brother-in-law's place at Lake City. His brother-in-law had a drugstore, Russ Davis, and he would jerk sodas in the afternoons and in the mornings, and play baseball in the afternoons. But baseball was a great love of his, and he was a good athlete. He graduated from the Citadel in the class of 1929, just before the stock market crash, and was fortunate enough to get a job at Randolph-Macon Military Academy in Front Royal, Virginia, as commandant of cadets and professor of military science and history and Spanish. His classmate and close personal friend, who was later his best man, was Tom Howie, who got the same job, a comparable job, at Stanton Military Academy. Howie went on, they parted company in World War II, and Howie was killed at St. Louis. And but he got started in my grandfather Smith, that was my mother's name, in Winchester, was the county treasurer up there, which is what we would call tax commissioner here, for 20-some years. So I guess it was not only in his blood, he married into it.
Yeah.
When his father became ill in the early 30s, he came back to Bainbridge to run the paper. Depression was at its peak. Business was at its worst. Accounts receivable weren't worth a whole lot. But he and my mother came back to Bainbridge, and just before my grandfather died. My sister was born in Winchester, and I was born in Bainbridge in 36. So I guess you know how old I am. But he ran for the legislature in 34, I think it was, and served a 1-2-year term there. And then his father died. And those were tough days in the Depression, and he ran for Congress in 36 and was defeated. Gene Cox defeated. It's a funny thing there, because it was one of the things that his opponents used on him was that his grandfather, the rumor was that his grandfather was a Republican. Well, that was certain death in South Georgia, and the thing about it is, I never did find out, and he didn't either, but he was postmaster in equipment. He was a Confederate veteran, he was postmaster in equipment, and his name was Sam Griffin also, and he got a job at the end of the war somehow or another, so he must have been a Republican. I don't know, but anyhow, it was a successful campaign tactic, and he didn't make it, but he learned a lot by it. And then he came to Atlanta, as did a lot of his political contemporaries. He got a job with the Revenue Department so that he could afford to be in the newspaper business, and that part hadn't changed a whole lot since then. But his contemporaries at that time were, of course, Ellis Arnold was Attorney General, I think, by that time. And Fred Ham was doing the same thing. He'd come up to get a job so he could live to do other things. And M.E. Thompson, and they were all good friends and colleagues. And later, at one time or another, in varying degrees, they were political opponents, but I think they remained friends throughout. I know they did. It was some rocky times. Then he was serving down in Musgrove, was executive secretary for the Ed Rivers. And I'm going to come back and tell you there's something animosity started, but I'll just give you the chronology first. Down in Musgrove was Ed Rivers' executive secretary, and he got an appointment, I think, to the highway department, the highway board. And he recommended Marvin for his job, and so he became his executive secretary, and that's where he was up until the oncoming war in 1940 and Gene Talmadge's election, and of course he wasn't invited to stay. Those times things haven't changed that much. And so he came on back to Bainbridge and resigned he had a reserve commission from Southern. And he resigned his reserve commission and enlisted in the Georgia National Guard and was appointed captain to raise a battery at Bainbridge, which he did. And he and Battery D of the 101st under General Joe Fraser, First World War veteran, who was a wonderful, wonderful man, big Presbyterian churchman. Harry Truman was his captain in World War I. They served together. And Colonel Joe took them all over at that time. Colonel Joe took them over to New Guinea. They were the first American troops in New Guinea. And they arrived in, I think it was May 3rd, 1942. The Battle of Carl C was either imminent or just over. It was about the same period of time. And he stayed there until 1944 when Colonel Fraser came home and was sent to Europe, promoted to brigadier general, and went to Europe, and he commanded the battalion, and then he came home on rotation with a number of the troops. Ellis Arnold had called him, and he wanted him to come take over the National Guard because of the General Howell, I believe it was in ill health and was going to have to retire and wasn't able to proceed. And so he did. He came on. I remember that was a big day for us. Hot day in the summertime in Bainbridge when the train came in, and all of them came off. They were all yellow because they were taking Atterbury, an artificial quinine, and it turned them all. We didn't know whether it broke jacks with them or not. But he came home and immediately was back in Camp Stewart, Fort Stewart. I guess it was still Camp Stewart at that time with tropical malaria. And so we got him back after a while, and eventually, of course, he transitioned on into executive general. And then he was going to run for governor. Gene Talmadge wanted to run again, and he knew that would probably be futile, so he selected lieutenant governor. And of course, as you know the chronology on that, he was defeated. Didn't make it, and M.E. Thompson was, and he was still adjutant general. And Gene had asked him to continue on as his adjutant general, which he was flattered. And so he was there to referee and be the interlocutor for the three governors affair. And then after that, he was getting ready to run again in 48. And no need to go through the history we already know. And then, of course, he He ran in 48 and was elected for the unexpired 2-year term, and ran again in 50, got a 4-year term, and then in 54 he ran for governor when Herman's term was over with. And those were exciting times, and I went to Georgia Tech in the fall of 54, about the time the election was over. So I was already in Atlanta when he was inaugurated. And I graduated in 58 and went into the Navy, and that's where I was until 1963. So yeah, those were interesting and exciting times. And in 62, Marion, the love of my life, came down while I was at sea, and from Norfolk and went to a number of rallies. And I came down just before the election in 62. The rest of it is pretty much history. So I came home in 63 and had a wonderful, wonderful, pleasant experience working with him.
One of my prized possessions is a DVD of all of Governor Griffin's rallies in 1962. And I recall one, you were President one in Marietta, and you were introduced by the governor. And you looked mighty young then.
I'm glad you can remember that. You don't look so bad right now, so that does.
Ben, let me turn to you a minute. You were Governor Griffin's executive secretary, and for our students and watchers, I would like you just to tell us about the job and what it is, what you do, so as we get along, they'll understand exactly what a powerful position that could be.
Well, it's one of the greatest honors that was ever bestowed on me. Governor Griffin asked me to become his executive secretary. I was a country lawyer, faction law in Tacoma. Faction law in Tacoma, and I was in the legislature. And I admired Governor Griffin so much, his sense of humor, and if you didn't want to like him, you better not be around him. He meant so much to me and my family that words are inadequate to truly express myself. But excuse me, I don't know what's happened to my throat today. Anyway, he's one of the greatest men I ever knew. He was a caring governor, and history's going to record a lot more good things about him the longer that we're around.
What I remember most about him, and I knew him well, I used to fish with him and hunt with him, and spend a lot of time, eat purloo with him, and which I enjoyed. My wife doesn't like it, but I do. But the one thing I admired about Governor Griffin was his great sense of humor. He could be funny when he won, and he could be equally funny when he lost. And I thought that was a great trait, and really was his personality. Let's get in now to his administration. He became governor in 1955. Immediately began working on an administration that was very, very progressive. Rural roads, hospitals, 50% increase in the school budget, Stone Mountain, more tourist outdoor facilities, farmers markets. He was genuinely a good governor, I thought.
Amen.
I agree.
Yes, and so, but, toward the end of his administration, he attempted to increase appropriations to his rural road program, and it didn't work. You remember that period?
I was there for the speech. I had a class cut so I could come over from Tech, and I remembered it at the time. And of course, in brief, it was simply politics.
So sure.
It was a good program. The first one, when we created it, it was a good program for the $50 million second. It failed, it tried, and it was so good that Ernest Vanderbilt adopted basically the same thing in succeeding governors and various points of view too. But it was strictly a spike deal, somebody wanted political advantage, and he was handy and convenient.
You remember the George Bagby story?
Oh, yes.
Could you tell us that?
Well, I tried to, and I'll tell you there's a post-lude on it that's almost as good. That during the Rural Roads fight, of course, he was a lame duck governor. He had 2 years to go. He didn't have anything to promise anybody. And, you know, he had my mother's main criticism of his, and I'll interject this to set the stage, was that she said, you know, she called him Pat, just like his father. That was what he was known as in up in front row. Said, you know, the only trouble with Pat is you'd have to slap him about 3 times real hard for him to get the notion that you might not like him. And this is true. He was a believer. He believed in people. He believed what people told him. And I'm of a more cynical nature myself, but I think he enjoyed life a whole lot more because he didn't dwell on things like that. He went ahead. But the Bagby story was that George was supposed to be in his camp. He'd always been friends and been reliable before. And of course, Marvin didn't have anything to promise him, so he got down on the House floor to make a very impassioned speech, changing his loyalties in that manner. And he apparently either didn't care or had forgotten that Marvin had a speaker that he could listen to what was going on down there and keep up with things. And somebody came in the office and said, turn on your speaker. Said, George is making a speech. And he did, because he could do it too. George was good. He said, you know, I know that this might have repercussions, that it might cost me personally. It might even cost my brother John his job as a license examiner, I think is where he was. He said, but I've got to do it, my conscience demands it, I've got to do it, and he went ahead and came out in opposition to it. And my dad picked up the phone, as he tells it then, and called Peck, because he didn't know George Bagby had a brother. Picked up the phone and he called Peck Dominic, the head of State Patrol, and said, Peck, do you have a license examiner named John Bagby? Peck said, yes, he did. He said, well, it's 11 o'clock or whatever time it was. And he said, by 12 o'clock, I want him gone. And then he sat down and he wrote a telegram to George, and he said, George's impassioned speech included, said, if it cost John his job, it just cost him. He said, not a word. If he gets fired, if he loses his job, said, I've got a meal in the barrel, and I've got ham in the smokehouse, meat in the smokehouse, and we can split a whole kid. He can come and I'll look after him. Marvin wrote him a telegram, and he said, dear John, and he did George. Said, get the meal out of the barrel, divide up the whole cake, and get the meat out of the smokehouse. John's headed your way. And of course, it made George mad, and the problem was every time he showed it to somebody, what Marvin had done to him, they started laughing. So he said, pretty soon he just quit showing it to people. And of course, we all got to be friends again later on, but that was one of the classics that I've got.
Well, Mr. Ben and I were talking about this earlier. Back in those days, you made friends even though they were your political opponents and they beat you. You don't see that much today in politics. Everything is so partisan.
Well, they weren't all like that either then. They weren't all that good human. I guess it's as good a time to explain how his greatest political liability was the enemies he chose early on. And when he was executive secretary for Ed Rivers, a couple of things happened. One of them is that one of the scions of the newspaper family, and I'll be a little circumspect, tried an armed robbery at a drugstore, and in the process shot and killed the pharmacist clerk. His name was Richard Goliath. They called him Dapper Dick Goliath. And the newspaper lobbied to get him a pardon. and Ed Rivers wouldn't partner. And he had checked in and out on the thing. Well, it's got very involved in from the fact that tried to spring him from jail by bringing him from Reedsville to Atlanta for a medical emergency, and in the process they waylaid him and got him out. Anyhow, that was the one thing. So there was an animosity with the newspaper back then. The second thing, that set the stage, the second thing was when Ed Rivers' highway chairman, Miller, during the Depression, he didn't have the money to pay the teachers. And Ed Rivers said, well, said it's a question of priority as far as he's concerned. He would just put some highway projects on hold and use that money to pay the teachers, because that had to be, the roads could wait, education could. And Miller said, indeed not, said, we're not going to do that. We're going to get rid of road projects. And so the outset of it was, Ed said, well, I appointed you, I can unappoint you. And he said, no, you can't. So they wouldn't let him put him out of office, and he got an injunction to keep him from putting him out of office. And Governor Rivers sent Marvin and 2 or 3 other fellows over there to remove him from office. And they took his chair and hauled him out in the hall. Well, they were arrested for a charge with contempt of court, violating the injunction. And of course, the papers were against this then. But Marvin had already written several editorials, and I'll send you some editorials, letters to the editor, about how unfair it was, and it wasn't anything but a personal vindictiveness on the part of the newspapers. And that, well, let's just say that relationship did not improve over the years. And they lit out after Ed Rivers. That's when they started a business about scandals for pardons and things, which was a lot of hooey. And one of the things they beat Marvin over the head with later on is that he got a pardon for himself. Well, of course he didn't, but when they were ready to leave office, it was a $200 fine, by the way, and that was as big as a house in those days. And Marvin said, asked him, he said, he'd asked him apparently, is there anything he could do for him? He said, yeah, you can pardon me for that citation there, for filed contempt of court citation. So he did. And newspapers never explained how that came to be. As far as they were concerned, he got himself a pardon. So he picked his enemies early on, and they continued on through his political career, which was fine with him, because his political philosophy was very simple. He said, never pass up an opportunity to help a friend or to give an enemy hell. He said, if you don't discipline your enemies when they deserve it, they won't respect you, and your friends won't understand it. And I think this is true. And what he didn't count on is that part of the group that formed the faction against him throughout his career included the Atlanta newspapers, and they were going to be right to the record. And they did, and that's where it is today. And that's why so much of what you see then and now, the continual allegations, and it's kind of like the Georgia search warrant. Troopers used to say like the Georgia search warrant, said, well, that's where 2 troopers drive up to a house, and one runs around the back, and the other goes up and knocks on the front door. And the front door, one on the front door says, open up, it's the law, and said the one in the back hollers, come in. And said, they get in that way. Well, documenting your own allegations is what it amounts to, and this is what he faced. And I think he probably would have handled his tactics with them differently had he realized that when it was all said and done, and we used to be friends, and we were enemies, and we were friends, and we were allies, and we were opponents, and all that was fine. But when it was all said and done, they wrote the record, and it was written on allegations. Yeah. And for political purposes, which was fine with him at the time.
Yeah. Well, he, he went through that grand jury process and no wrongdoing. So, I would think that vindicated him with the history.
Well, it was, that was drummed up pretty much too by his same political opponents, and who financed the Keaton-Head, Paul Webb Keaton-Head Commission. and went on through with that, and he's always been a nicer fellow than I would have ever been, and I think my mother would have been more, but during that time, there was a state official who was part and parcel, or at least assisting the prosecution, who at the time, if I recall it, that there was an allegation that he had received money on such and such a time date at his office or wherever it is. And at the time and date that they alleged, one of the state officials who was in the room with him had been with Marvin and a number of other people, Vance Custon, you may have been there then, went up to the Black Hills to tour the sculpture up there in the park. They were getting ready to do Stone Mountain. I'm sure Scott County was probably along there with it too, but had gone up there to see how they had done things. Of course, Goodson had done that one up there, and this particular state official was willing, but he was too drunk to remember where he was.
Uh-oh.
And he didn't tell that. My mother would have told it. Now, she was sitting there, if I'd let her loose, she would have done it. She would have told it. But it was that kind of thing, and that's politics. And at the time, I don't think he bore any long-lasting ill will about what was happening then, because, he gave no report and he asked no report.
Right.
But he didn't realize that they were going to have the last word. It was going to be in front.
Yeah. Well, that's what they say, as it go, don't argue with
Fellow who buys ink by the barrel.
Yeah. Well, but reporters in the Capitol at that time were very fond of him. And
Well, he loved it, wasn't
Yeah, he did. And in fact, he called them Joe Reeves.
he? Right.
You know what that means?
Oh, yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, the jewelry is I think the correct name is the towhee,
Oh, he.
but with crackers it's jewelry. And he's a little bird that takes 2 hops forward and 2 back, 2 hops forward, 2 back. And flips up brush and leaves and things, looking for stuff all the time. In fact, at the Atlanta Press Club, they had I won't say who it was, but someone in Decatur County shot and had stuffed a jewelry on their request, not Marvin's. I don't want to say that.
Yeah.
But they had one in there, and they had him up to dedicate the jewelry in his behalf at the bar at the Atlanta Press Club back when it was over on Peachtree over
They still have a golf tournament.
there. The jewelry golf.
Jewelry golf tournament.
Well, they had some professionals. They had some other fellows too, but
Yeah.
M.L. St. John,
Yeah.
Albert Riley.
Yeah.
God, those were great guys, and they told it like it was, and it wasn't always favorable, but it was always honest. Then there were some others.
Well, a good, successful first administration, as I said, very progressive. Did a lot of good things for the state. And then he decided to run again 4 years later. And he entered the race against a young state senator who was supported by that group you just described. And do you remember anything about that campaign?
I remember some of it because I was in the Navy at the time, and I was with a helicopter squadron at Task Group Alpha most of that time, so we spent a couple months at sea and come back to it and go back out. I think, though, it's important to note that a lot of things happened in that campaign. The first one, he didn't enter it against Carl Sanders. Carl Sanders came into the race after he'd already made his intention known. But when they went into the race, there was a county unit system. And television had not come into its own in political campaigns. Those two particular things, I think, worked against it because he had all the baggage that he had accumulated. Every time you go to the well, you may get a bucket of water as far as going to running for office and getting elected. And you make a lot of friends, but you make just as many enemies. He used to say about the roads business, he said people who thought that they could make political heyday on headway on paving roads, we were sadly mistaken. He said if you paved the road that went by 10 houses, you made 9 ingrates and 1 outright enemy. So that wasn't the way to do it. And I guess the Rural Roads program showed that in the final analysis. But when he entered the race, it was under the county system. he wasn't sure who his opponent was gonna be. He thought it was gonna be Garland Berger. That was before his famous heart attack.
Yes.
And so it changed a lot, and that was the last campaign, I guess, in Georgia where people tried for motorcades and rallies and things of that nature.
That's right.
And a good-looking young fellow, very articulate young fellow, and a fine man. I don't have a problem with him. Was running against him, and he had actually a clean slate. He had very little record of anything to have to run on. And the second thing was he was facing that same crime, the Atlanta newspapers, the bank, and the coalition of the Atlanta and Fulton County politicians who he did not endear himself to them. Ben, you were probably there during the period of time when Cracker Barron wanted to get a liquor license. And
I think Tom Gregory
was Tom there then?
he succeeded me when I was appointed to the commission.
And he came over there to get a liquor license, and of course you had to get the state, local license before you could get a state license issued. He came in, he made himself. He couldn't get a liquor license in the city of Atlanta unless he was willing to pay some money under the table. And he said, you ought not to have to do that. And Marvin agreed with him. And he picked up the phone, and I guess T.V. Williams, Rick Williams,
Revenue Commission.
he said, tell that crowd over there at Fulton County, the city of Atlanta, there won't be another liquor license issued until Cracker Barron gets his, and he better not have to pay anybody. And he did. But that kind of business didn't endear him with the thing. So he had a good, strong group to run against, and a lot of money.
He was one of the, I guess, the last great stump speakers. And I was always impressed by his ability to relate to his people. And in those rallies you talked about, it was very obvious. There were thousands of people out there, barbecue. And when he lost, he said,
There's been a lot more people eating my barbecue than voted.
that's right. Another example of his great humor. He lost that race, but he didn't get out of politics. He came back home, and as I recall, he was very active on behalf of other candidates there for several years.
Yeah, not so much in the state at that time until just one occasion, but he was interested in some of his contemporary governors. He worked with George Wallace, and he remained friends for years. And, he worked for Gerald Ford, and of course, you know, he stood in so that they could have a name on the ballot for George Wallace until they could get a
Vice
full-time
President
candidate.
candidate, yeah.
And but he remained interested and kept up with politics. He wrote a column twice a week. By that time, he wrote twice a week in the Post-Searchlight up until the week he died.
There was a little box on the front of the Atlanta Journal with an editorial, Piney Woods Pete. And I think that gave birth to, incidentally, what did he call it? Puny Woods Pipe?
Yeah.
But that gave rise to Willie Highgrass.
Well, actually, Willie Highgrass, I think, was before Piney Woods Pete. But Willie Highgrass was a composite. He was all things. He was the Georgia Cracker, the ordinary, everyday thinking man that didn't have a lot of assets, perhaps, but had an awful lot on the ball. And that was who he identified with. I still use Willie Highgrass.
Do you?
Willie Highgrass speaks to me when my columns preach. You know, you got to have somebody to pin his thing. But he was the epitome of the Georgian, rural Georgian of that time. When he referred to Willie Highgrass, it meant everybody.
Right. So now you have the paper that was run by your grandfather and then your father, and it serves the community well, I'm told. Do you take political positions? Do you endorse candidates?
We don't normally endorse local candidates. And, you know, I think it would offend my readers. They think that they probably, now they want to know all that's going on, but I think they figure they're able to make up their own minds. But so far as regional and state candidates, we often do, and we do frequently, because our readers will call us and say, tell us, we don't know any of these people, tell us what you know about them, who you going to vote for, and why. And I try to be as square with them as I can. Sometimes we pick right, sometimes we don't.
Yeah.
But we don't get involved in the local politics. And the other thing is, because we're in the advertising business,
Yeah.
and we figure we've got to be able to serve any candidate to come, and then work with the winner. So
What is the best thing you remember about your father?
just him, basically. He was my friend. He was, excuse me. He was bigger than life. He never worried about anything. Now, he could get mad and he could get upset and so forth like that, and then he was gone. But he had the ability to analyze anything that happened to him and very quickly switch over to a scholarly style, he's the old school teacher, and analyze it, and if there was something that he could do about it, and he could think of something, he did it. And if he didn't, he quit worrying about it. And I didn't get those genes somehow or another. I'm just, I worry about everything. If I'm not worried, I wonder why I'm not. What am I missing, you know? But he took life, he loved people. And as I said before, he got bitten and burned a number of times. But he enjoyed the people that he met, and he didn't hold many grudges. There are a few. He did not suffer fools gladly. But at the same time, he was just a tremendous man of wonderful intellect and understanding. And I can remember 1,000 times when I popped in after we were working together and would say, I think so-and-so and so-and-so. And he'd say, well, and then he would explain to me. And by the time he finished, we wouldn't be an argument. He would just tell me what he thought, and I would figure he was right. He didn't have express a lot of regrets.
You lost a sister in the Wyandotte fire. That affected him very deeply.
He never got over it.
Yeah.
He was here at the time. He was adjutant general, and he had taken her out for dinner. It was a fire conference, and he'd taken her out for dinner. And he was staying down at the old Piedmont. She was staying close at the Wyandotte, and he heard the sirens and commotion. He went out, and he spent the day. In fact, he wound up at Grady Hospital. He thought he found him and sat there by a bedside holding this young lady's hand. She'd been burned, and he discovered it was not she. And a boy from Bainbridge, Earl May Jr., found her out in the Cato thing, and he never got over it. Now, my mother was able to eventually come to terms with it, take it in stride and so forth. And she would talk about my sister, and we remember good times, but he very, very seldom could bring himself to talk about it. Very, very deep.
How should he be remembered?
What you see is what you got, and a lot of the people thought he was putting on things that he wasn't. But he was a tremendous. He had a tremendous mind. When he found out he got cancer. But he did this with the aneurysm. First thing he did was go to the library and get a book and know all about it. And then come lecture me and anybody else who would listen exactly what it was. In the same way with his cancer. But he was a man of great integrity despite the allegations against him. He was a very forgiving fellow, a very loyal individual, which was probably a fault. Because he did a tremendous job, I think, for the state of Georgia in education, particularly in higher education with the reactive tech and the science center, teachers' salaries, and retirement, and all of those things. And he, I think, on one of the DVDs you were so kind to give me in the Griffin years, landed nearly a new industry a day.
He did, yes. He did.
And his industrial development, his salesmanship was wonderful. He had a way of talking with anybody without talking down to them or being cowed. And most people who met him, I think, like him, some people couldn't believe that he was sincere, I'm sure. But I think he did a wonderful job with that, of dedication to the district, because with roads. And he just, well, his epitaph, so to speak, was publisher, statesman, soldier, and that was what he did. All of his men in the 101st outlined it. I don't think he ever, during the 2.5, 3 years that he was in charge of them in the jungle, they found him from the jails. I don't think he ever had any court-martials. He didn't have to. They knew that they were going to get it if they misbehaved, but they knew that he wouldn't embarrass them, and that he would look after them, and that when it was done, it was done. And that was over. There are not many of them left. I still go to all their reunions, and I think this coming year, next year, will be the 101st.
You resemble your father.
Well, thank you.
They have the same hair. You do really look like it.
That's quite a compliment.
The governor would be very proud of Sam, I'll tell you that.
Yes, he would, yes. And he has reason to be. He has reason to be. Well, gentlemen, I would like to talk on past bullbat time, but time is short, and we're going to have to thank you for coming. We appreciate it. It's been very enjoyable. I've learned a lot, and I know those people who see this presentation will learn a lot. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity, Bob. And thank you, Ben.
Well, I just listened to you.
Oh, Ben been family with us for years and years.
Yeah. Good. Thank you.